So welcome to today's Intro to Python workshop. Before we go into detail about what we're going to be going over, I want to highlight that this isn't a complete introduction of Python. Python's a massive language that has a lot of different applications. This includes machine learning, data analysis, web development, and application building and finance. But the goal of this tutorial is to at least get you started with Python and hopefully inspire you to continue learning more about programming and how you can use this tool to separate you when you're applying to jobs or graduate school. And the reason why we start with, or why I wanted to start with Python today is because Python's a very readable language. It'll be really easy to kind of figure out what's going on in a program, and it offers a high level understanding of programming. So you don't need to worry too much about memory and space allocation when working in Python. So for today, we're going to be going over a lot of the building blocks initially, and then we're going to see how these building blocks develop into the larger parts of the program or a system that will be that you find in huge applications like Facebook or Instagram. So we're going to be starting off with base types. Then we're going to move into container types, the things that contain the base types. We're going to go into indexing and sequencing. Then we're going to go a little bit into logic statements, followed by loops, functions, and then a little bit into objects and classes. But we won't go into too much detail today because it is a big can of worms if we do decide to open that up. The structure of this tutorial is going to include multiple breaks, hopefully at natural breaking points. So I'm aiming to do a 25-minute tutorial and then taking a break every 25 minutes and then having a 5-minute break in between. And as I mentioned, this tutorial is going to involve your participation. So as listeners, it'd be helpful to receive your feedback afterwards, to hear about your experience in the tutorial, to get things you liked and things you didn't like, as this will help with future workshops. So just to get started, if you have your Jupyter notebooks open, I'll be doing some live coding, so you don't have to worry too much about typing fast enough as we go. But starting off with base types. So starting off with base types, we're going to be working with integers. And with integers, these are any whole number that don't contain a fractional component. So you can imagine any number, say 5 or 6 or 4 or 7, as their whole numbers, and they don't contain a fractional component. And with programming, you can do really simple things like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and we'll move into the other operators that you can use as well. But for integers, you're just going to want to understand that they're just the whole numbers and don't contain any fractional component. And if we run that, we can see that Jupyter Notebook nicely outputs the value of the addition equation. And in Python, if you're coming from R, you'll recognize that in R, you'll be using the hyphen, less than hyphen to assign variables to values. In Python, instead, you'll be using the equal sign. So it makes it a lot easier to assign variables, and it makes it more intuitive as well. So if we want to assign some variable X to be 5, when we call that variable X again, we get the output of its value, which is 5. And you can use this to build other variables that might include the previous variables that we've already built. So if we create a variable Y, which is equal to X times 4, we'll receive the output when we call Y, and we'll receive 20. Again, with integers and with programming languages across the board, you can do all types of operations. In Python, when you're working with exponents, it's 2 asterisks. As you can see, 5 to the power of 2 is 25. You can also do division, multiplication, and in one case, which you might not be too familiar with, is modular division, which returns the remainder of a division statement. So in the case of 5 modular 2, you'll receive an output of 1. With Python as well, there's a way of checking for the type of data type you're working with. And we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail. It's called the type function. But essentially what it's doing is it's taking whatever you input in between the parentheses and checking the data type that it belongs to. So in the case of integers, when we enter the type 10, or when we enter 10 into the parentheses and we want to check the type, the notebook nicely outputs the fact that it's an integer data type. And this will become important when you want to make sure that the data type that's being inputted is correct. An example would be checking for date of birth. So if you're asking people for their date of birth and they don't enter a real value or a valid number, you might probe an error and tell them to enter a valid birthday year. The next thing we'll be going over in terms of data types is floats. Now, floats are real numbers which contain a whole amount and a fractional amount. So this means any value with a decimal point. And in Python, a value, even though it has 0 as its fractional amount, still registers as a float value. And the way we can check this again is with the type function. So if we enter 4.0 into the type function and we run this, we see that the type of value is a float. And so the key difference between integers and floats is that floats contain a fractional component, whereas integers just contain the whole number. And I haven't mentioned this, but all these values, whether integer or float, can also be negative. So you can have a negative float value, and we can check this again using the type function. And once again, you can also do the same for integer values. Now you might be asking, what's the use of floats and integers? Well, the basis of programming it was to work with large numbers and perform numerical analysis. And when you might be called to convert between floats or integers really depends on what you're doing. So in one case, you might be looking for the whole number of something. So say you're rounding for weight at a grocery store when you buy food. And the weight of maybe some apples that you buy might be, let's say 13.6 kilos. You're buying a really big bag of apples. You run that. When you get the integer value, you get the whole number when you convert this value to an integer value. The same goes for getting a float value. Say you want higher precision when you are, again, maybe say buying apples from the grocery store. We can use 13.6 as well. And you want to convert this number to get the float value to ensure you're not paying too much or you're not paying overspending for your apples. And you can also get the fractional component of the weight of those bags of apples. Some applications for this, again, are for rounding numbers or for getting more precise numbers when doing numerical analysis or data analysis. So those are floats. So we've gone over floats and integers. And those are mainly the numbers that we'll see in Python. We'll also talk about Boolean values. So if you're unfamiliar with Boolean values, this is just another word for true and false values. So true or false values are Boolean values. And we can see in Python, we can assign variables to also be Boolean values. So we can say x is equal to true. And when we call x, we'll see that it just returns the Boolean value true. And we can also check this type. So to ensure that we're receiving a Boolean value when we check the type, Python outputs bool. Hopefully everything is clear so far. At the moment, we're just going over the basic data types in Python. So again, integers, floats, Booleans, and now we'll be going into strings. And strings are an immutable sequence of character data. And what that means, I'll explain that in a little bit more detail, but a way to format a string in Python is one of two ways. So we can say some name variable is equal to, let's say, Dennis. This also works, but you can also use just the single quotes. It doesn't really matter what you use. What I ask is that you don't mix and match because that's weird. Don't do that. But with Python, it's able to recognize both single quotes or double quotes as strings. And now when I referred to strings as being immutable sequences of character data, what I meant by that is that you can't change certain parts of a string after it's created. So let's say we wanted to change parts of my name. And this will go a little bit into indexing, which I'll talk about later on. But if we take the first letter of my name, and in this case is D, when we call that in Python, we start at the 0th index. And I'll explain indexing a little bit more. But when it comes to strings, we'll call the first letter and we'll see what it is. So in this case, the first letter again is D of Dennis. But if we try to change this, let's change it to Y, we get an error. So once a string is created, you can no longer change the characters in a given string. And this is what I mean by an immutable sequence. Now with strings, to kind of change them once they're created, you can concatenate or you can add strings together, or you can format them. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail right now. So let's say we want to create a statement and we'll create a statement variable. We'll assign it with an equal sign and we'll say hello world. This is kind of like the most common introduction phrase that when it comes to programming. So we'll create this statement called hello world. And when we call this statement, it prints out the string. And in some cases, there are special operators with strings that can change the way it's formatted after it's printed. So in the case of hello world, we can also add a \n, which signifies a new line. \n is an operator that signals a new line. The machine reads this as a special character and then recognizes it when it prints and then does something a little different. So if we call statement again and we update it, and then we call the print statement to print our statement hello world, we'll see that this new line operator formats the string a little differently. So we can do things like that. With strings as well, we can also create first names. So you might want to do this with your name, just to make it a little bit more personal. And you can concatenate these two strings to give a full name. So we can say first plus last. We'll see it prints the literal string. Notice how there's no spaces here because what Python is doing is it just adds the two strings together and kind of disregards the intuitive formatting we think about when adding words together. So when you try to concatenate words, you actually have to input the spaces that you want to add into a string. So as you can see, after inputting a space, we can see that the full name looks a little bit more like something we'd read in a book or in an article. And then another way to format strings is, again, we'll run with this name example again. And using the print function, we can format it so that it changes depending on the variable itself, instead of continuously trying to add different words or change how it looks by constantly updating it. So I'm going to go over what's going on here. This might look a little funny to most, but we're using the print statement again. So the print function, sorry, looks like this. What it's doing is it's printing whatever is within the parentheses. And in the parentheses, we've added this string, which is denoted with the double quotes. We want it to say hello, comma, and then these curly brackets. Now these curly brackets act as a placeholder that works in tandem with the method that I've added in the end called format. So as long as you can recognize that this is a placeholder and we're using the format method, you can kind of understand how this print statement is going to go about outputting what we want. So we've asked, we're calling Python to print hello, comma, placeholder. And in the placeholder, we want to format it to enter the name. And we've signaled what name was up here, and we've assigned it to the variable name. And the value of the variable name is Dennis. So when we call this print statement, what ends up happening is we see that this placeholder gets formatted with the name that we've specified. So that's another way to format with Python. And those are the 4 main data types that we'll be going over today. So that includes integers, floats, Boolean values, and strings. And just to make sure you guys were paying attention, we have a couple of true or false questions. So first one being 56.0 is considered as an integer value. And I believe I'll open up the poll here. Should be available. I think. Okay, cool. And everybody. Okay, we're just waiting for a few more. And a hint to check if this is the case is using the type function. So you can actually just enter 56.0 into the type function in the parentheses, and you can see whether or not that's the case. I'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, cool. All right, we're going to end poll and we're going to see for ourselves what the case is. So if we enter type and we enter 56.0, this function is actually, or this data is actually a float. So if 56.0 is considered an integer value, is actually false. Okay. We'll go on to the next one. So true or false. Again, another hint. If you just type this out into your machine, you'll see the Boolean value of this statement. And I will open another one, relaunch poll. So true or false, the string 100 is the same or equal to the integer value 100. So maybe this is a little tricky. So does this string equal this integer value? And what that will return is false, and whether or not that's true or false. Again, a little bit confusing. My apologies. Okay, great. Perfect. So let's test this out. So the statement itself is, does this string of 100 equal the integer value 100? It returns false. So this true or false statement is true. So if you answer true, you got that one right. So true or false, strings are mutable. Okay, great. So again, we can test this out with an example. Whoops. Let's take some string and set it to school. Let's take X, let's take the first letter S, and let's try to change the first letter. The first letter to R. And we get this error. It lets us know that strings are immutable. Okay, so that was the first section. We went over the base types. These are the key data types that we'll talk about for the rest of the day. It's been about 25 minutes now. So we're just gonna hop into a 5-minute break. I'll be sticking around if you guys have any questions. Also, let me know if I'm moving too quickly and I'll try to slow down the pace. But good job so far. You guys are answering the questions pretty well and recognizing some of the characteristics of these data types.